Now I'll tell you a little bit about the corals. The first interesting fact is the coral is actually an animal, not a plant, which really spins people out because they look so cosmic. But the coral, being an animal, does actually rely on little algae called zooanthellae that grow within the coral, which not only give the coral its colour, but allows the coral to use the light energy as an actual food source. So basically, the coral is an animal, the coral has the little algae within it, which rely on light, so we must have enough light. We also must have enough water flow to wash away the waste from the coral and also to bring new nutrients to the coral itself. A coral is a sensile organism, which means it can't actually move. So wherever you position the coral in the aquarium is where it's pretty much going to stay. On the other hand, there's also fungi, which look just like a coral and excrete calcium carbonate bases, but they can move along the bottom. There's also anemones, which look similar to fungi, and the anemones have got a soft foot and they don't excrete the calcium carbonate base, and they can move anywhere they want around the aquarium, including up the walls and the sides of the aquarium. But the anemones are not corals. There's also starfish and urchins and cucumbers and all these other things that you can put into your reef aquarium, which are beside the coral themselves. The two main types of corals that you're likely to be involved in are soft corals and hard corals. Basically, a hard coral is any coral that retracts into a hard calcium carbonate base. On the other hand, a soft coral will either contract or droop over, but into itself, not into a hard calcium carbonate base. So when a soft coral dies, nothing is basically left in that particular spot. Whereas a hard coral, when the coral dies, it's left with a calcium structure, which actually goes on to become live rock. You can really see that these soft and hard corals are really thriving in this aquarium, very much because of the water quality, the strong light and the good water flow which is offered. Even in this case, the clownfish have mistaken this coral for an anemone. Now the anemone fish and the coral don't really have a symbiotic relationship, but confused clownfish will often go into the coral for their own protection. Just as we've got our 1, 2, 3 fish, we also have 1, 2, 3 corals. So, same thing. Ask when you're purchasing your corals. Make sure that your advisor is aware of the environment you're offering, and make sure that they advise you before you buy them. Is this coral generally an easy coral to keep? Is this coral a coral that some people succeed with and other people don't succeed with? Or as a number 3, is this coral one that normally doesn't work? It really helps to have an understanding before you purchase your corals, how hard the corals are to keep, just as important as it is understanding how easy the fish are to keep before you purchase them. Now, I've been called out to this aquarium because of a fear of a disease. Now, she was quite concerned that there might be a disease or an infection going through her corals, but all it really proved to be was a series of circumstances that seemed to cultivate pretty much at the same time. Now, this aquarium's been running for quite a while, but she's recently seen some downturn in some of the corals that she's keeping. So what I'll do now is just walk you through some of these little positioning points which we really want to be aware of. Now, the first thing is the position of this tubopora. Now, with all of these really porous corals that have got a very porous structure to them, it's really important they don't build up with sediment, because you will find that when they build up with sediment, that they tend to gather denitrifying bacteria within them, which can slowly release hydrogen sulfide, which the corals obviously don't appreciate. So with a lot of these types of corals, like the tubopora, it's a really good idea to, on a regular basis, grab hold of it in your hand from underneath and give it a really good shake. Make sure that you get all of the mold and the detritus out of the pores of this coral. This tubopora is also right on top of an air stone. Be aware of where your air stones come up, because a lot of the corals do get quite irritated by the constant massage of the air stone. Now, in the far corner over here, we've got a Duncanopsis omnius, which has obviously fallen off the top of the reef. Now, this is a very regular occurrence with a reef aquarium, especially if you've got large fish. Now, the large fish that are quite strong will often throw around and actually relocate your corals. So you really need to be checking on a weekly or twice weekly basis to make sure the corals are where they're supposed to be and that the fish haven't knocked them over. Because when you have a coral fall over, usually not only do you lose the coral that has fallen because it will often land on its face, but it'll often sting the coral it's landed on. One of the biggest issues of putting corals in a reef aquarium is definitely ensuring that the corals don't sting each other. Now you can see quite clearly here that the Duncanopsomnius at the top has missing a couple of polyps because it's been stung by the Catallophilia underneath. So be really aware when positioning your corals that they're not stinging each other. This Catallophilia coral is withdrawing on the left hand side. Now there's two quite clear reasons for that. One is it may be getting irritated by the bubbles which are coming up very close to it, and second is it's in direct flow from the water flow outlet from the power head. So when you see this happening, one side of the coral's opening quite well, the other side is quite withdrawn, you do want to relocate this coral to ensure that it's not getting too much water flow or irritation from the bubbles. Now if you are going to have an air stone in your aquarium, make sure that the air stone is able to come straight up to the surface and then expel the air. Make sure your air stone doesn't come up underneath any power head or pump outlets, otherwise it will blow micron bubbles through your aquarium, which can irritate some of your corals. Now particularly with these large flat style corals, in the wild they'd be growing flat, so therefore this would be the sun source and the coral would be flat. Obviously that's not very appropriate for viewing in an aquarium because you wouldn't get to enjoy the benefits of this particular coral, but that doesn't mean you can position it like that. So often I come and see big flat brain style corals. Now the light is coming from here, whereas in the wild the light would be coming from here, therefore maximising the amount of photosynthesis that coral can enjoy. If it's sideways, it's really not receiving enough light. Sure, it's fine for viewing, so therefore keeping that coral on about a 45-degree angle is really the way to go. Now you can really see a very developed bacterial infection on this coral. I would suggest the reason why, when most of the other corals are going quite well in the aquarium, is that when you watch the particles floating around, it seems to not really have much water flow there. So the water seems to be coming around the outside here, and that particular spot there seems to be quite dead. Now it's good to follow the particles in the water, because you'll find when the little air bubbles and the particles in the water are moving quite quickly, then you can assume that there's adequate water flow over the top of the coral. Now if there's not enough water flow in that particular area, what you'll find is when the coral excretes its waste, the waste is not swept away from the coral quick enough. So therefore it almost ends up living in a layer of almost its own waste, which obviously makes it more susceptible to bacterial infections such as what you're seeing. So making sure that this area has more water flow will ensure that these corals are more likely to do well. Anemones like this one are a really popular addition to a reef aquarium. An anemone is not a coral. A coral is an animal which has a calcium carbonate base which can't actually move. It's a sensile organism. And an anemone can move around the aquarium, which can be quite a disadvantage as far as trying to keep a nice display like this one. These two anemones here are behaving very well. They're nicely on display at the front of the aquarium. But you need to remember the anemones have personalities and have the ability to move. One of the most fascinating things about the anemone is the symbiotic relationship that the anemones have with clownfish. Now clownfish use the anemone for cover and refuge, and the anemone will use the clownfish as a feeding source because the extracts of food from the clownfish and the waste from the clownfish is actually a food source to the anemone. Different types of clownfish prefer different types of anemones, and a lot of it is the personality of that particular clownfish for which anemones it prefers. So it's a matter of seeing which anemones suit the clownfish that you have, or vice versa. Probably the most fussy of all the clownfish would be the Ocellaris and Percula clowns. Now most of the tomato clowns and Melanopus clowns, they'll take to most anemones. Skunk clowns are not fussy. The anemone is an invertebrate animal, and within the anemone is zooanthelle, which is a little algae which will use the light. So in regards to food for the anemone, if you have clownfish in your aquarium, you don't actually need to feed your anemone because it'll get 90% of its energy from the light anyway, and then any other nutrients that they will need will be provided to them by the clownfish. It's quite common to see the clownfish actually run off and get bits of food and bring it back and keep it and feed the anemone itself. Though if you do want the anemone to grow, feeding it a piece of prawn or a piece of whitebait once a week certainly will help to enhance its growth. Now, an anemone is capable of totally engulfing and consuming a fish. Some species of anemone, this is particularly rare for this to occur. On the other hand, with some anemones like carpet anemones, which have got a stronger sting, this may occur more often. So letting the anemones find where they want to be and then positioning your corals around them out of the anemone's reach is probably quite a good idea.